Welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Norris. We're going to grow your leadership through neuroscience, psychology, and theology. Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode number 36 of the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. My name is Patrick Norris. Our goal today is to help you lead with a whole heart, a healthy brain, and a soul on fire. I'm so glad you're with us. In today's episode, you'll hear from one of my favorite people to interview, Steve Cuss. Steve is an author, lead pastor, sought-out mentor of pastors and marketplace leaders, has 1,600 hours of supervised ministry in clinical pastoral education, and has done extensive work as a chaplain at a level 1 trauma hospital. This episode is entitled Managing Leadership Anxiety. Our conversation covers everything from chronic anxiety, burnout, to drivers that make us think we need something that we don't actually need. We look at leadership resilience from being misunderstood, how to investigate covert anxiety and its destructive nature, how leaders tend to use reactive speech to control uncomfortable environments, how every gifting has a shadow side, how anxiety controls group leadership meetings, and how anxiety spreads virally in leadership circles of an organization, how exploring our personal griefs is necessary to thrive as a wholehearted leader, how griefs show up when followers leave, ghost, or attack the leader, and a whole lot more. You're going to really enjoy this inspiring, insightful, and energizing show. Before we jump into it, I want to invite you, your networks, and staff into one of our personal discovery experiences. Personal discovery experiences are 2-hour online events with me, a psychologist, therapist, and with a group of 6 to 20 peers, and we discover the roots that drive individual stories. These training events are designed for those who want to know what drives them and to better equip them to lead those that are in the organization. The next cohort for senior pastors will be September 21st. Our next cohort designed for church ministry staff is September 28th. Then the general population cohort is October 26th. And if someone struggles with addiction issues, our next one for recovery is September the 27th. To find out more, go to redinkrevival.com. But first, if this podcast is adding value to your leadership in life, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to this podcast, like it, and comment in the reviews at iTunes. Also, help us get the word out by simply sharing on your own social media platforms. We really appreciate it if you do that. Go to reddinkrevival.com and check out everything that we are up to. And while you're there, sign up for our e-newsletter that'll hit your inbox the first of each month with a powerful blog post as well as all our upcoming events. Go now to sign up. Let's go now to this week's episode number 36 with Steve Cuss as we talk through managing leadership anxiety. Well, welcome everybody to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. I am so excited to have Steve Cuss in the house. Steve is a lead pastor of Discovery Christian Church in Broomfield, Colorado. He learned a lot of his therapeutic processing, the foundations of things as a chaplain at a level 1 trauma hospital, and has 1,600 hours of supervised ministry and clinical pastoral education. He's got a Master's of Divinity from Emmanuel Christian Seminary. He's the author of an amazing book called Managing Leadership Anxiety. Everybody ought to get that. He's also married, has 3 kids, and you're going to find out he has this infectious accent because he hails from Perth, Australia. Steve, it's great to have you on the show today.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, great to be with you today.
Well, let's jump right in. Tell us a little bit about your backstory. What motivated you to become a curious anxiety student?
Yeah, I didn't know it at the time, but I think it's my own anxiety is probably what made me curious about it. It started, as you said, when I was a chaplain, and I stumbled into chaplaincy truly, from my point of view, by accident. I don't believe from God's point of view it was by accident. But I needed a job. I was a brand new married guy, and I needed to put money on the table for a year. while my wife finished up school, and the local hospital was hiring chaplains, and inexplicably, and that's a longer story, but inexplicably they offered me the job. And I was underqualified and I was too young. I didn't meet most of their criteria, but for whatever reason, they offered me the role. And I really think it's because God knew with my personality and wiring, without that experience, no one would be able to live with me. I was, white, middle class, stage charisma, entrepreneurial, quick thinker. So always affirmed for these gifts that tend to get some of us into pastoring.
Yeah.
And it was chaplaincy that in a very beautiful and painful way, stripped me of all of those gifts. It's not that it stripped me of the gifts, but none of those were beneficial in the face of people's overwhelming pain. And that was the beginning of what for me has been a 20-something year journey of really understanding there's this whole thing under the surface in my life that if I don't figure out what it is, it's going to take over rather than God taking over. So that's kind of the short story. And then as a lead pastor, about every 3 or 4 years, I hit some kind of wall and just think, I gotta find a different way to be healthy in leadership. And so it's just trying to mine deeper and deeper, I guess.
When you were at the level 1 trauma hospital, talk just a little bit about what that looked like, felt like. What was that?
Yeah, so level 1 trauma simply means that this is the hospital in the city where every other hospital sends their worst patients, really their worst emergency patients. And then this is the hospital where the ambulance goes first if they pick somebody up in bad shape. So, they've got the helicopter flying in, the whole deal. So it really just meant between that and they also had a whole hospice wing, which was more home-based. I used to go to people's homes and help them die in their homes. For a young ministry student, what it means is about 300 deaths in a year. It means meeting people at the absolute worst moments of their life. One of the supervisors, he said, look, any trauma hospital is just the microcosm of its own city. So whatever's in the city, you're going to see in the hospital. And that was true. We had Wiccan people. We had gangs. In fact, our hospital had its own police department. And one of my more memorable experiences was a gang fight that broke out in the emergency room lobby.
Wow.
I wasn't quite trained for that in Bible college. But mostly what it is walking, truly the absolute privilege and challenge of walking into people's most vulnerable pain and trying to be helpful and really ultimately trying to represent the presence of God in these moments. And sometimes the moment would last 5 minutes and sometimes it lasts several days, but that was kind of the job.
How does this, we got so many things I want to talk about, but how do you do that, engage that every day, 300 different cases, and not become numb, not become robotic, not become putting on, the grief that you're constantly confronting would have to be overwhelming. How did you manage all that? And what did it do to you?
Oh man, what a question. It did a lot to me. It made me afraid that my wife was going to die. There are these pathological responses. There was a season where the emergency room beeper would go off, and I think I wrote about it in the book, and I would simply pray, please God, don't let it be my wife. Please don't let it be anybody I know. I think what it does to you, and this is the intentional part of the clinical pastoral education training, they intentionally plunge ministry students into trauma to help you figure out your own fears. And the whole idea is that every pastor is a human before we're a pastor.
Yes.
And if we're not aware of our humanity and the shadow side of it, it's going to take over whether we know it or not. Wow. And so I definitely got numb. No question. There were times where the beeper would go off and I would actually be bothered that, at its most extreme, I'm sitting in the break room watching Seinfeld reruns because they're a great antidote to death. It really is a show about nothing.
You, man.
Yeah. So you can just numb out to Seinfeld.
Yes.
I'm eating my chuck wagon steak, my deep fried steak. This is in the South because this is back in my day when I could metabolize anything. Those days are long gone. and the beeper goes off, someone's died, and I'm angry at the person for dying on me because I've got my nice little shelter.
Yeah.
And so what it looks like is I've got about 3 or 4 minutes to go from that feeling to noticing it, naming it, dying to it. So by the time I walk into the room, I'm not letting my frustration, it's absurd to even say, but it's very human.
Yes,
my frustration with the person for dying and inconveniencing me, not letting that infect my ability to care. And of course, that frustration was a numb reaction, like I can't do another kind of idea. But boy, if I didn't do that work, what would happen? And I'm sorry to say I did this. You'd walk in, you'd spend 6 minutes. You'd listen, you'd quote Philippians, pray. And I know so many pastors that do this. Let's wrap it up with, let's wrap this up with prayer. I tease when I do workshops, I tease people like if you're ever closing a meeting in prayer and it's the first time you prayed, God doesn't listen to those. God's like, you're just wrapping this up. You're not actually talking to me.
Yeah, it's a wrap up.
But a chaplain, you've got a lot of power when you walk into a room. And so your ability to manipulate the grieving person so you can get back to Seinfeld, that's a real problem. So I think for us to remain human and to remain in the power of God's Spirit and not in our own power, we have to be so aware of these competing forces in our life. And that's really my work, is helping people identify them.
Which is so incredible that you tuned into that. And I'm laughing about you feeling inconvenienced as a pastor. I think that happens on multiple occasions, just with a phone call, an email, when you're in the middle of something, a text. And certainly when something big like that happens where somebody died, I know that our audience so resonates with that. Let's now move into your faith story, because you obviously just consuming your content, you care about psychology, neuroscience. How does all that come into your faith story and help make sense for you?
I love that. I love that question. I'm fascinated right now by the intersection of those three that you mentioned. And I love that that's really the focus of your show. I think for me, what happened, I grew up unchurched. So I really did come to Christ completely blank slate. In fact, when I went to Bible college, they made me take a Bible entrance exam. How much Bible does this kid know? I got a 21%.
That's awesome, man.
Oh yeah, I couldn't put Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the correct order. I was a blank slate. So I went through what then was really, I would say, really excellent 1990s theological education. I feel like my college was fantastic. I feel like my seminary is fantastic. Somewhere in that journey, I just hit a wall where, more Bible isn't going to do it. More prayer isn't going to do it. And it's not a very Christian sounding thing to say. So it took me a long time to word it this way. So I think I was on this pursuit before I knew how to name it. I just think that psychology, brain science, and Jesus are almost after the same thing. There's one distinction with Jesus. They're after life transformation, freedom, and peace. I think Jesus came to help us get that. And I think the missing piece in brain science and psychology is worship. I think the end result of freedom and peace is the worship of God. So I'm always interested in taking concepts off the therapy couch and putting them into the Christian life, and hopefully sifting them through the gospel of worship. That's kind of my big idea, I guess.
Absolutely. Well, you spend a lot of time, obviously, with your book, Managing Anxiety as a Leader, Managing Leadership Anxiety. And anxiety is a focal point of your energy. Why anxiety? Why is that such a big deal? You are an influencer of a lot of spiritual Christian leaders, pastors, marketplace leaders. Why is it that you wanted to talk about anxiety? What's the big deal?
Yeah, anxiety is a broad word, and there's really like 5 types of anxiety, and I only deal with one. And so I'm interested in what's called chronic anxiety, because I think it's the primary source of burnout and pressure in a leader, particularly. And I'm also interested in chronic anxiety because my chaplain supervisor was trained directly under Murray Bowen, who is the founder of what's called family systems theory.
Oh, wow.
And so I got a front seat. And all this guy, George Dobler, his name is, I learned so much from George. All he ever talked about was systems theory. At the time, we teased him about it. I didn't realize what a gift I'd been given,
Wow.
but George let me sit in on his counseling appointments and really was very generous with his knowledge. And chronic anxiety is a technical term in family systems theory. It's simply the anxiety that we hold based on what we believe we need that we don't really need. So PTSD is a real thing, and that's not my wheelhouse. Generalized anxiety disorder, like these are real things. Acute anxiety is actual threat. Like if you're driving down the interstate and you think you're going to get into a car accident, because acute anxiety is a short-term threat, you can then calm yourself afterwards. Chronic anxiety is long-term, and you aren't able to calm yourself afterwards, but it feels to a leader like acute anxiety. So we're getting a little technical, but your body cannot discern between if you're going to get into a car accident or if somebody disapproves of you or if you feel like an idiot. And so my training is helping people dissect the sources of chronic anxiety in their life, these false beliefs. One for me, Patrick, would be I believe people need to understand me at all times in order for me to be okay.
Yeah.
In fact, right now, I'm in the middle of a very gentle Twitter war where I intentionally, I never feed the trolls on Twitter. I understand. But one of the tools I teach people is to bravely practice. If I tend to need to be understood, then the way to help me get dislodged from that is to be intentionally misunderstood so I can practice. So right now I'm engaged with some fairly racist Christians, which is a hard combination of words to put together.
Right.
They're coming hard after me. And they're mocking me right now. They're mocking my last name. Probably when we're done with the interview, I'll go see. There'll be 20 tweets. It's wild. And I'm just practicing being misunderstood for my own well-being.
Amazing.
And all of us have these chronic needs that we think we need that we actually don't need. So if I can help a leader notice them, name them. So back to my chaplain story, that need to dismiss that lady who died so I can get back to Seinfeld. That's a false need. I actually have the power through Christ to go into that room and be fully present to those people. But if I'm not aware of this false need, that will run my life instead of Jesus.
That's such a powerful thing. When I talk to people, it is so common for a person to say, yeah, I don't struggle with anxiety. Anxiety is just not something that's a big deal for me. I remember talking with somebody who's a good, dear friend of my family and our ministry, and he struggles with alcoholism. And I told him, I said, there is an anxiety issue at the root of this. What we're struggling with is an intimacy disorder that is driving the behavior. And I said, and so here's how we might think about that. And he's like, whoa. He said, I got to tell you, I'm one of the most chill people on the planet. I don't deal with anxiety at all. And so I began to break down the brain for him and helped him understand that this isn't just throwing something at the wall and seeing if it sticks, that if this is your behavior, I promise you, you have some unaware anxiety that's behind it. Can you talk about anxiety in the context of so many pastors and leaders assume that they are living free of anxiety, yet their behaviors are actually telling us that they have a lot of anxiety?
I think that's so profound. That's exactly right. So just to shortcut the question, like we'll get to to shortcut it. If your folks are watching this and they're saying, I'm really not an anxious person, the next step for them is to ask their spouse or their child, how do you know when I'm anxious when I don't know I'm anxious? Mm-hmm. And if you're a safe person, which is an if, they will tell you. And if that's not available to you and you're a safe person, ask your team, ask someone that works with you. How do you know I'm anxious when I don't know I'm anxious? The problem is people in that kind of thinking, they believe anxiety is worry and fear. And they say, well, I don't really worry much. I'm not afraid of much. Therefore, I'm not anxious. but they mansplain. They have to have the last word.
Yeah.
Like you said, they have these secret habits that are destructive to them and other people. Exactly right. That's a profound evidence of anxiety. And then it gets really sophisticated. What I learned, the very brutal lesson for me as a chaplain, was in my first several weeks of chaplaincy. I'm not prone to broad brush statements. Let me just say that. I try to be careful, but this is a true statement. Everything I said, everything for the first several weeks that I said to somebody in pain was not for their anxiety, it was for mine.
Wow.
And it took me a long time and a lot of help from the chaplain supervisors to really understand that when I'm speaking into their pain, what I'm doing is I can't handle the size of their grief. Who can speak into death? But I can't handle being silent because I have a need to be helpful.
Mm.
And I believe being helpful means using my Bible knowledge.
Yes.
And the amount of times I would quote scripture to someone, honestly believing it was helpful to them. And because of the power dynamic and my role as a spiritual leader in that room, they would say, "Thank you, chaplain, that was so helpful."
Mm.
And it wasn't. And it took me about 10 weeks, which, great, that's fairly quick. But when you're doing it for a year, you got to get these lessons going. It took me about 10 weeks to shut up and to be able to sit with somebody in their pain and resist the urge to speak. Because every time we speak, we're controlling.
Yeah.
Every time we're watching and listening, we're out of control. And Patrick, the fact is, too many pastors actually don't know how to walk by faith in their leadership. I'm not saying they don't know how to walk by faith.
Right.
But in our leadership, we're so used to speaking, the vision casting, the preaching. And so when we are in an environment that's out of our control, if
Wow.
your people watching have a tendency to speak, that's an anxious response.
Wow.
Now, it doesn't mean that speaking's always bad. All I'm trying to do is let people have a quick pause before they speak to check.
Yeah.
Is this actually for them or me? And over time, you'll be able to notice when it's for the people and when it's for yourself.
We do retreats for pastors. And in the retreat, we'll have some lecture time, but we do a lot of process group. And we sit in a circle, 6 to 8 people, and it's a therapist, psychologist, and myself with some pastors. And it's interesting, at the beginning of the week, you'll have a pastor tell this just emotional, grievous story of their past. And when they do, all of the other pastors sitting around hyper jump to resolve it, to make them feel better. And what you experience is this intolerance of discomfort. I can't emotionally sit in this. And of course, through the week, we model for them and walk it out where we sit with people in their pain. We explore the pain. So rather than feeling like we, are sitting here as a powerless individual to be able to hear, we can actually sit with people without having to do anything and just be present with them. When the end of the week, they're very calm and connected, which is so amazing to watch. But I'm still fascinated myself about this idea of having to have control. I've heard some of your content before where you talk about how leaders always are predisposed to controlling things.
Or to be proactive, like the positive way we would say it is leaders are prone to action,
prone to action. And even in one of the podcasts I heard you on, you were talking about how during a coronavirus, we as leaders move to how do we do more? Because let's
produce more content.
Yes, anxiety is making us have some level of perceived control, even if it's not real control. We think that it is. So talk to us a little bit more about this, idea of needing control and the anxiety that's underneath that, of us feeling like we're not valuable, we're not lovable, we're not seen, we're in threat of survival if we don't have control.
Well, and in the defense of a lot of faith leaders, your congregations are also pressuring you to have an answer.
Wow.
And to produce content. So I don't mean to bag on faith leaders that are suddenly hyper productive.
Yeah.
Because I get it, and I'm feeling that pressure too. One of the things I do that has been really helpful for people is I try to identify environments that generate anxiety, to where if you're simply in that environment, you will be anxious. And it helps people feel a little less crazy. And one of the surefire environments is ambiguity. If you are in an ambiguous situation, it will generate anxiety in your life. I don't care who you are.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we've been in ambiguity now for, 15 weeks or something.
Oh.
Feels to me like it's more ambiguous than even 6 weeks ago. It felt like 6 weeks ago we were starting to get to some clarity. I'm not sure now. I'm not quite sure what we're dealing with right now. But in the face of ambiguity, it's very difficult for a leader to not then jump to certainty or control.
Yeah.
And that is generally an anxious response. And this is where I want to be so careful, because producing content's not bad. It's the automatic reaction to produce content without thoughtfulness that's the problem. It's a subtle difference.
Yeah.
So I don't want to make an impression that anyone who produced content in this time is obviously anxious.
Right.
But it's when I was a chaplain, I served on the code team. Anytime someone's heart stops, and if you've seen a TV hospital drama, the cart rushes in and the clear and the paddles and all of that.
You bet.
There's always a chaplain there too. They never show those on the TV, but there's always a chaplain. And after one particularly grueling code, the lead doctor came out. I'm not in the room, by the way, for the code. I'm sitting with a family 10 feet away, hearing everything. The doctors get to do something. They get to hold paddles and make commands. The chaplain has to sit and wait. That's a good test of your anxiety capacity, is when you're just sitting with an anxious family and waiting for a long time as you hear everything behind you. Anyway.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah, it's good training. And boy, the doctor came out. It looked like he'd run a marathon. He's sweaty. And he pulled me aside. He knew I was a chaplain student. And he said, "Hey, chaplain, here's the deal. Anytime somebody's heart stops in the hospital, before you run into the room, just first take your own pulse," he says. And I'm like, what? just first check your own pulse. And he's simply saying, just take 3 beats to check before you act. And I think that's really what I'm suggesting in our impulse to proactivity. Proactivity is a gift, but being a slave to it is where leaders will burn out.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you are looking at this control profile, I've got to have control. As a leader, we're predisposed to it. We're proactive with it because we're to influence. I mean, John Maxwell, definition of leadership is influence, and to kind of control towards a goal, an objective, and then rally everybody to move that direction. And often what we do is we judge ourselves as being a bad leader. The shame narrative rises up in our head whenever we don't have control. And yet for you, you have talked about how you have at times stopped and embraced the idea I don't have control to help you mitigate the anxiety. Talk to us just a little bit about how you as a leader, I mean, you obviously have a great church. I've heard things about your church. We have a mutual friend who brags on you incessantly. He says that you and I are going to get together and geek out. But
that's my take so far, Patrick. This is great. I'm loving this.
Me too, absolutely. Well, how as a leader do you merge all of this to where you're abdicating control, but you're also leading? You're actually applying the influential power God's given you.
That's a big question. And I'm always mindful on an interview like this, the limits of time and nuance. But I think the pathway through this answer is just the simple recognition that every gift has a shadow side. And that over time, if a leader's not careful, the shadow can outpace the gift. So control, entrepreneurialism, proactivity, those are the gifts that have really allowed God to thrive, like to bless our church through my leadership. What's also true is if I'm too big a presence in my staff, if I'm the one that's always charging the hill and they're following behind, I'm not building a healthy team. If I'm, like there's the control gets in the way of leadership health as much as it benefits.
Wow.
And that's I'm always concerned about making it sound like I think we should all sit in a hot tub like hippies. I know, like my team would say, this guy's type A, he's driven, he's always trying to get stuff done. They would say that about, like, that's my natural wiring. I'm just saying there's got to be a way to take that from your unexamined impulse and instead consider it like a tool belt, like a handyman has. When a true handyman comes into your home, he or she have all these tools in their tool belt depending on what they're fixing. And I think the unexamined leader, it's more like they have one hammer and they know how to hit everything.
Yeah.
I think I'm just trying to cast a vision that like Ecclesiastes, there's a time to take the hill and there's a time to weep.
Yeah.
And too many leaders take these personality tests and then they hide behind them. They say, well, I'm just, you got to deal with it. This is the kind of person it's a gift from God. And I call rubbish on that. I just say, no, you actually have a broader ability to connect with a broader range of people than you realize. The metaphor I mostly use is scuba diving.
Yeah.
If people are familiar with scuba diving, when I'm training pastors, when they're not in the habit of this, like I've had some pastors say, how do I sit in someone's pain? And they'll say, I'm often complimented for being an optimistic person. I'm a look on the bright side person.
Oh.
I'm a in Christ all things are possible person. It's a great question. And I just say, look, just if somebody comes into your office, picture that you're scuba diving with them and they've gone to a depth. Now, if your tendency is to try to get them up a little bit, what would it be like if you actually go deeper than them and then let them raise you to the surface rather than you? If they've gone deep, and you're quoting, I can do all things through Christ, they're going to get the bends. Like they're going to ascend the water too quickly. You're doing damage.
Great illustration.
And I learned this in suicide intervention. I used to do a lot of suicide intervention in a mega church in Las Vegas. And the basic rule of suicide intervention is you take somebody's problem more seriously than they do.
Yeah.
And so when they come in and say, I want to kill myself, oftentimes the tendency of a Christian is to say, you know what, it's not that bad. All these people love you. But in true suicide training, they say the next question is to go deeper. How would you kill yourself?
Yeah.
Then you let the person say, oh, you know what, I'm not going to do that. Or they would say, well, and they'll tell you how. But pastors find that helpful if they can kind of feel when they're trying to bring someone to the surface, but boy, take them, whatever depth they went to. And, I think the simplest way to do it as a control type leader is when somebody's sharing something with you that's raw and vulnerable and you're feeling yourself needing to say something, all you have to name is what they're feeling. And it sounds like this is exactly what you do on your retreats. Yeah. That's all they need is to say, it sounds like you feel really lonely and at the end of your rope.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's about all they really need out of you. They don't actually need... hey, could be worse or whatever. But that's my family of origin. We're wonderfully resilient people, the Cusses, but we're it could be worse type family, so it took me a long time to acknowledge my own pain and all of that.
Oh my gosh, I get it. And addiction modeling shows us, in fact, when you look at the factors of recovery, what was the predictor or the energy piece that you used that help you recover. So we have, hundreds and even thousands of case studies now where in retrospect, after a year to 5 years to 10 years, a person has lived sober. You go back and you ask, what was the most important and impactful pieces of your recovery? And just even in a secular research environment, the number one thing is a higher power. A higher power. I believe that the reason that a higher power rate's so high is because the way it's presented to them is the abdication of control.
Yes, that's right.
And once they abdicate control, then the driver, the anxiety towards control that has been driving the behavior of addiction now then is losing its power over them. Well, I think about that as a pastor. I think about it as a leader. I think about it as a husband. I think about it as a dad. What are the things that I control that really are not about leadership? They really are driven by these energy pockets of anxiety. Anxiety shows up in so many different areas that most of us are not tuned in. We've never been trained to actually label it, identify it. One of the areas that you talk about is the area of burnout, that a person who is burned out deals with internal and external anxiety. Talk about that a little bit for us and help us unpack it.
Yeah, I think the number one fallacy of modern leadership theory is that burnout is connected to workload. I think that's such a fallacy because most leaders I know who I respect love a big workload. We actually get motivated by it. I actually get lazy if I don't have a fairly hefty workload. No, I think the reason leaders burn out or have these secret habits that you're talking about, this ever-increasing gap between their public persona and their private life, is because of unaddressed chronic anxiety. It's I can't take one more critical email. It's the triggers of, as you're talking about control and addiction, it's very similar. It's climbing through a different window into the same house. It's what I call the false self. And and by me, I mean Thomas Merton and Thomas Keating really are the ones that got us going on that language. But I think so many leaders are not aware that they're operating primarily out of their false self. And that's when you can start to identify your need to be understood, you need to have the last word, you need to be liked, and how those needs are antithetical to releasing control to Jesus. That to me is the pathway to freedom.
And all of those things you're talking about are actually driven by anxiety again.
That's right.
Every piece that is this false self, which, false self is just the essence. You're made in the image and likeness of God. You have your true self. And yet we build these grief, loss, trauma modules that we put into our operating system, and then we make that ourself. And it's like, no, there is a true self, image of God, and then there is this false self that you now are using mechanisms to survive, to belong, and not even realizing that anxiety is behind all of it. One of the things that you say that just is so interesting, you say that whenever you go into an elder meeting, a board meeting, you go into some environment with staff, whoever has the biggest expression of anxiety is actually going to control that meeting. Can you talk about that? And then how do we de-escalate such things?
Some of my favorite work with leaders is helping them learn to notice anxiety in a group. And what I love about it is we all already react to it. I'm just trying to teach you how to bring it into your more aware consciousness. And so you can go into any group and you can work to spend half of your attention on the agenda. What are we talking about? But spend the other half of your attention noticing anxiety spreading between people. And again, to our earlier definition, the most anxious person in the room holds the most power. It's not always the most worried person in the room. Sometimes it's the loudest person. Sometimes it's like in your retreats, it's the person sharing their pain, and then that well-meaning pastor speaking to it. That person now has become the most powerful person in the room, unless the facilitators step in and re-guide. So every leader, this is a muscle that we all have. It's not like I'm uniquely gifted. It's that I've just exercised this muscle a lot of paying attention to anxiety process. And so the lowest hanging fruit I know on how to notice it is a leader can start paying attention to the recurring predictable patterns in any group of people. So let's take your staff. It's almost always the same person who has the last word, almost always the same person who speaks up first. It's always the same group that have the meeting after the meeting. They kind of have their own say. And even as we're talking about it, some of your viewers already know they've already got names in their head. You already know this. You've just never been trained maybe on now what. And so it's a larger conversation than we can do now, but the pathway to bring cultural health is a term in systems theory called the differentiation of self, which is a very Googleable term. There's a lot written and YouTubed about differentiation of self. And of course, I write about it too. And then the second is I simply call it naming the process. So much time I spend, if a leader will call me or connect and they'll say, hey, what do I do in this situation? And they'll give me their case. They almost never tell me the content of the case. They usually tell me the process. This person says this, and then I get all defensive, and then I get combative, and then I feel like I have to apologize. But I don't actually know what they had an issue about.
Yeah.
And more often than not, I'm simply saying to them, is there any way you could name to that person what you just told me? You just laid out the process beautifully for me. Yeah. What would it look like for you to sit down with that person and in a non-accusatory way say, I don't know what to do because I find myself defensive. I bet you felt that I'm reactive too. And it's never like you. It's always, here's what I'm doing that's making it worse. So I coach people to say, first confession, here's what I'm doing that makes it worse. Then curiosity. What do you see that I'm doing that makes it worse?
That's so good, man.
That then gives you the power to say, could I share what I see you doing that makes it worse?
Yeah.
Now, this is a power tool. It's like handing a chainsaw to someone. So in the wrong hands, that can really do a lot of damage. I'm mindful as a lead pastor. If I'm having this conversation with somebody who's lower than me in the hierarchy of my organization, I have to be so aware of the power I hold.
Yes.
And therefore really become quite diminutive and try to come underneath that person. We can go into differentiation too, but that's a technical tool.
I love differentiation. I love all of the different pieces that you're pulling out, the things that you focus on. Even this emotional intelligence to where we are able to go into a room and rather than look at the data, look at the emotions, feel the ebb and flow, feel people's dispositions and what they're saying. Is it aligned with what they're feeling? Is there somebody in the room that is easily aroused to communicate things? And why are they easily aroused? What is in the psychological systems that are making that so? And you know, the interesting thing is so many of us don't have any training and to tune into the emotional component of a group. Right. I had a scenario where I was at a stoplight and I looked down. I was trying to call an appointment that I was running late for. And so I looked down, I'm trying to dial in to find his number. And I look up and all the cars at the stoplight had been gone for a little while. And I'm like, oh shoot, nobody honked, nothing, so I go. Well, I'm talking less than 15 seconds. I have a police officer behind me. His lights are blaring, and so I pull off into a neighborhood, and he comes up, and I guess he was having a real bad morning. He just had a ton of energy that he was coming at me with. And he said, he tells me with a real direct and harshness what he experienced. You know how long you were at that light? And I said, no, sir, I don't. And he, goes to tell me how long it was. And then he says, were you texting somebody? And I said, no, sir. I said, I was trying to find the phone number. He said, can I see your phone? I said, sure. So I give him the phone. He won't let up. And so finally I did what you just said. And it's all tuning into emotions. Because the data here is that he is accosting me. He is ready to get after me. And so I just said to him, I said, sir, I'm experiencing you're angry at me. Is that what you're wanting me to feel right now? And immediately he tuned into his emotional state. And he said, oh, no. I just, I see so many people who get in car wrecks and I just am trying to protect. And immediately it calmed him down.
Yeah,
it is amazing, the name it. You talk about this, the name it to tame it. That when you name it, it does something in the brain that calms the anxious circuitry. Yeah. I'd like to move from that idea into talking about grief for a little bit.
Yeah.
Because there is this fusion of grief to anxiety. And if I could, I know this is a broad topic, but if you could just talk to grief for a few minutes here and help us think about how grief is a hotbed of anxiety and why we live in anxiety. Go into that if you could, please.
Yeah, I would love to talk about grief. I think it might be helpful to hear, are you interested in the grief that a leader carries or how a leader helps others in their grief? Because it is, as you said, a big topic.
Yeah, let's talk about the grief that a leader carries. Because, we have griefs from our childhood wounds and sorrows, the traumatic experiences. We've had accidents, losses. Then you get into leadership, your gifts begin to rise up. You have vision and dreams, and then the vision that's delayed, there is a deep yearning for experiencing, but the frustration of it not happening and the grief that is there, your brain's trying to figure out how to make sense of what's happened. And what do I got? Anxiety is I've got to do something so that I don't stay in this stuck area. And until that grief is processed, they are going to be in a stuckness of life. So all of that, just hit it and go any direction you want.
Yeah, okay. So some leadership grief is born out of false belief, some of it. And oftentimes that it's grief that I would call based on, like when you describe the loss of a dream, it's often a false sense of what success looks like. I mean, this is rampant, for example, in church planters. Yeah. Church planters really wrestle with the dream they had and the reality they're in. The pathway through that grief is radical acceptance and just a real clear target on what faithfulness versus success is. I mean, right here in Colorado, our part of Colorado is famous for church plants dying because we're just a tough environment for a church plant to get going. And so many church planters, particularly from more Bible Belt regions, one guy a few years ago, he came and within 2 years, he had 120 people come into his church, many of them unchurched. And we're saying to him, this is phenomenal. This is amazing. And he's feeling like a failure. He shut the whole thing down and went back to the Bible Belt.
Oh, wow.
Because his vision was mega church, but really what he was trying to do is figure out, how do I get on the stage of Catalyst?
Yeah, right.
And tell my story. He wasn't actually interested in faithfully loving God's people in Colorado. So there's that grief. The grief I'm more interested in is actual genuine grief. And I don't think anyone can tell you what to grieve about and how to grieve. I think my experience with many leaders is we are afraid that if we really look into our grief, we'll no longer be productive. We'll just be rocking in a corner in the fetal position. Yeah. So my experience is too many leaders will not look at their grief because they're afraid that it'll knock them out of ministry. Yeah. I think the good news of the gospel, and the Apostle Paul is our model, is Christ's power made perfect in my weakness. Yes. 2 Corinthians 1, the God of all comfort who comforted me so I can comfort others. And most of my pastoral power comes from my ability to share my pain with my congregation.
So good.
And so in our church, we had the absolute horror of burying 4 young fathers in 5 years. All 4 of them being key leaders in our church. We were pretty small at the time. We were 150 to 200-ish. So one of them was my volunteer worship leader. One was the chairman of my elders. One was the guy in my life group. And then one was a leader before I came. I came to this church when it was already in existence. And I would have to frequently bury them on a Saturday and then preach on a Sunday. Oh, my gosh, yes. And 3 out of the 4 were dear friends of ours. Our kids raised together. And I was dying. Like it was a time in the church where I wasn't sure I'd make it. And a lot of the reason I made it as a pastor is I shared my grief with our congregation. I do think there's a constant temptation for faith leaders to stop being human and start looking like a leader. Yeah. And we just don't believe that vulnerability is actually a powerful tool in God's kingdom. So I would encourage leaders, whether your grief is over lost dreams or actual lost loved ones, if you're willing to look inside, it really hurts. And it's not efficient work, which is also a struggle for leaders. Yeah. But I think if you can believe that your pastoral power will you will attract the kinds of people you'd rather have at your church if you're able to grieve publicly than if you're giving the impression that you're a together leader.
Wow.
And so in my congregation, the amount of people in my church who are life-giving to me and who take incredible care of me is pretty phenomenal. If there's time for a story, the most poignant example.
Please do, yes.
Oh my goodness. It was December of 2018. I got a phone call. It was like 8 a.m. on a Sunday, and it's someone I hadn't talked to in a long time. And he said, "Hey, did you know?" And he talked to him. I'll call this guy David. Did you know David took his life?
Mm-hmm.
No, I didn't know. And I had been an early mentor in David's 7 or 8 years before. We had kept up, but we were not close at the time. He had posted very publicly in social media about his suicidal tendencies. He checked himself in when he needed it. And that week, he had made all these appointments to try to keep himself stable. And then at 2 a.m, he couldn't do it. And it was so close to when I was up to preach, I didn't have the time to realize I have no business preaching today. I was so grieving, but I was so in shock that I wasn't able to even say, I need to get someone else to speak. So I get out to preach at 9 o'clock service, so I'm walking out about 9:25. And I start the sermon, and 6 minutes in, I just lose all control.
Wow.
I'm blubbering on the stage, and there's even now it kind of triggers me, but there's like 300 people watching me in the moment I'm realizing I've got I can either try to manage their emotion or I can just tell them what's going on.
Yeah.
And I'm just gonna. So I said, I need to tell you what happened today. I told people, and then I read a scripture, and I said, I'm just going to walk off the stage, have the band, and the band came up, we closed out. Second service, I got my associate to preach. The thing that really struck me was I had one person handle me inappropriately, but the other 300, the people who are already quite close to me, maybe a dozen of them, came backstage, gave me a hug, prayed for me.
Wow.
The other 200 and something just left me alone. And I looked at that, I thought, I love this church. Like the people, there are churches where you want to like save the pastor or, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Some of those weird tendencies. Most of my congregation who were not especially close, they just knew this isn't the time for me to do that. And then the people that I am close to took care of me, and it was really a profound experience. So I would just cast a vision. What if your leadership is exactly human-sized? And then those people in pain, when they need you, they will let you in deeper into their life than they ever would have if you didn't share that.
That's so good. Beautiful story, man. Yeah. Well, on the idea of grief, one of the areas that so many pastors struggle with is, it's kind of like when you are a child and you dream one day getting married. You dream you'll be married to people for life. And so when you get ready to church plant or take over a church and you build relationships and bonds, and you see families with young kids and you think you're going to marry them off as they get older, you'll baptize their kids, and there'll be a legacy, and one day you'll sit on the front porch of a house and talk the big, amazing war stories and memories.
That's lovely.
But what ends up happening is that often people transition from your leadership. Sometimes they ghost you. They will leave and not even communicate about it. Yeah. Sometimes people who are close friends somewhere along the line have left, and it creates a grief profile in your brain. And what would you say to a pastor or a leader who struggles with grief around that?
Yeah, I would really encourage you to name it, embrace it, grieve it. I know in my own wiring, I'm just not prone to take seriously my own pain.
That's powerful.
And there's a whole bunch of reasons for it, but I have to work to sit and say, I'm hurting. I think in my case, it's a control mechanism, like no one can touch me kind of idea. And so when I say that really hurt, it makes me feel weak,
Yes.
So I would encourage that. I would also say it's real. I found it helpful cognitively to remember that I'm always wearing at least 2 hats with everyone in my congregation. And sometimes I think I'm only wearing the friend hat. But what's been most painful to me is the decent people with their own narrative who, because I'm a leader, see me through a lens that isn't accurate to me.
Yeah.
You know, their own narrative has tainted the way they see me, and I'm unable to help them see me as human. And because I think most pastors would say, very few people leave a church and say, boy, what a gift that church was. They're usually scapegoating the pastor on their way out.
It's true.
I've had plenty of that myself, and it really hurts.
Yeah.
Especially when you have poured into those people, sacrificed for them. So I think naming it and feeling the pain is really healthy. I think it helps to remember that every friendship in the church is tainted by that second hat.
Yeah.
And that at least helps me take it less personally. But if my wife were here right now,
good.
she'd say, Steve takes it really personally. I don't.
Right.
I would hate to give the impression, especially since I wrote the book, that I'm somehow above it. It really hurts. It's the cost. It's one of the costs if you're going to be the leader. It's the cost you will pay, and it's. I feel like I'm rambling a bit, Patrick, but the best thing I've done is pray for those people and to do my own internal work so I'm not demonizing them and turning them into monsters for my own self-righteousness.
Yeah.
And I think in my early days, it would be kind of that middle school breakup. Well, if you don't love me, I don't love you. And because I'm a powerful person in our church, I have a lot of power to then infect other people about this person. So praying for them and blessing them, truly the words of Jesus, bless those who persecute you, really helpful for my own, so I don't become cynical.
Yeah.
Because my tendency is to want to team up against them so I can have a mob.
Yeah, which is interesting in this whole profile of anxiety, because you have the cynicism, you have the demonizing of the people. Well, why do we want to do that? We want to do that because of anxiety. Yeah, well, why do we have anxiety? Because we have an aggregate development of all of this grief over a lifetime.
Yeah.
And it's unresolved. So when you say, and I think this is so powerful, when you say to grieve it, literally, if you don't spend time to let your brain grieve things for however long it takes to experience the genuine grief and emotions that are surrounding it, what'll happen is you will continue to live in the anxiety. You'll continue to try to discipline yourself around cynicism and demonizing. And all of it is in your book and your content around anxiety is just awesome. It's just awesome. Steve, I just love. I hardly even know you, but I love you as a brother, and I'm honored that you were on today. How can people get a hold of your book, and how can they get a hold of any of your content?
Yeah, so my book is sold everywhere books are sold. My website is stevecusswords.com.
I love that.
Have some fun. Yeah, have some fun with my last name. And I do some Zoom coaching. I do in person, depending on COVID, obviously. So people can reach me through the website if they want. My favorite work is interactive, like we've done today. I much prefer it. I don't do many keynotes. I mostly workshop with people, give them a trait, then get them in groups of 3 or 4 to discuss. And so I've got some webinars coming up. People can jump in on where they're interactive on Zoom with me. I think they're coming up in August. So they can find all that on the website.
Amazing.
And then, if people are running an organization, I do works with teams and stuff. They can chat with me about that as well.
Steve, you're brilliant, man. I love your heart. I love who you are. Looking forward to spending more time with you in the future.
Me too. I hope so. That would be a delight.
Thank you guys for joining us. I hope you really enjoyed that. You might be wondering, well, what's next for me? Consider attending one of our Reading Revival webinars, personal discovery experiences, masterclass experiences, or retreats. Also, subscribe to this podcast at any podcast provider and on YouTube. Go to readingrevival.com to find out all the unique opportunities to grow your life in leadership. While you're there, be sure to sign up for our e-newsletter that'll hit your inbox the first of each month with a powerful blog post. Everything we're building is to resource you to be a wholehearted leader. I'd love for you to be a part of our tribe, and I can't wait till our next episode. I'm glad you're with us today, and we'll see you next time.